The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small cafe, blending with the faint scent of pastries and the quiet hum of early morning conversations. The morning rush had passed, leaving behind a few customers absorbed in their own thoughts. Emily stood at the counter, her fingers wrapped tightly around the last few coins she had. The cool metal pressed into her palm, a stark reminder of how little she had left. She had debated this decision for the past hour, questioning whether it was wise to spend the last of her money on something as trivial as coffee. But today, she needed it. Exhaustion clung to her body like a heavy weight. The past few months had been an unrelenting struggle, working 2 jobs, barely making ends meet, and carrying the silent burden of raising her 6-year-old son alone. She had sacrificed every luxury, every small pleasure, but today, just for a few moments, she wanted to feel normal. She stepped forward, hesitating before speaking. "1 small coffee, please." She placed the coins on the counter, watching as they clinked against the surface. The barista, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, glanced at the coins before offering Emily a brief, understanding nod. Without a word, she turned to prepare the order. Emily released a slow breath. She had feared that she might be short by a cent or two, that she would have to walk away empty-handed. But no, this small moment of comfort was hers. Just as relief settled in, a deep voice behind her broke the quiet. "Add a large latte to that," the man said, placing a crisp $20 bill on the counter. Emily froze. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting those of a stranger she had never seen before. He was tall, dressed simply in a dark sweater and well-fitted jeans. His hazel eyes held warmth, but there was something unreadable in his expression, something that made her heartbeat quicken. Emily started to object, but the barista had already accepted the bill and entered the order. "It is just coffee," the man said gently, offering a slight smile. Just coffee. But Emily knew it was more than that. It was kindness, unexpected and undeserved. It was a moment of being noticed in a world that often looked away. Her throat tightened, the words she wanted to say caught somewhere between pride and gratitude. She had spent so long doing everything on her own that accepting help, even in the form of a simple cup of coffee, felt foreign. But she was tired. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded as if he understood more than she had spoken. The barista placed both cups on the counter. Emily hesitated before picking up hers, feeling the warmth seep into her fingertips. She turned, preparing to leave, but something made her pause. She looked at the man again. "Would you like to sit?" she asked before she could stop herself. The man smiled. "I would love to." And in that moment, what should have been an ordinary cup of coffee became the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Emily hesitated for a brief moment before choosing a small table near the window. She carefully placed her coffee cup on the wooden surface and took a seat, trying to steady her thoughts. The stranger followed, his own cup in hand, and sat across from her. The cafe was quiet, with only the occasional sound of clinking dishes and the low hum of distant conversation. Outside, the city moved at its usual pace, cars rushing by, pedestrians hurrying to their destinations, all unaware of the unusual moment unfolding inside. Emily glanced at the man before her, unsure of what to say. He did not seem like someone who made random gestures of kindness. There was something intentional in the way he had paid for her coffee, as if he had understood something about her without a single word being spoken. She cleared her throat softly. "I appreciate what you did back there. It was very kind of you." The man gave a slight nod, his hazel eyes studying her with quiet curiosity. "It was nothing. Sometimes, small gestures make a difference." Emily wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers. "That is true," she admitted. "But I am not used to accepting help. I have had to do everything on my own for a long time." The man tilted his head slightly. "That sounds difficult." A small, tired smile crossed Emily's lips. "It is. But it is my reality." The stranger took a sip of his coffee before speaking again. "I understand. More than you might think." Emily raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his words. There was something about his voice, calm, steady, and sincere, that made her feel at ease. She hesitated before asking, Do you always buy coffee for strangers? A soft chuckle escaped him. Not always. Only when it feels right. His answer was simple, yet it held weight. Emily found herself wanting to know more. She exhaled, allowing herself to relax just a little. I am Emily, by the way. The man offered a warm smile. Nice to meet you, Emily. My name is Daniel. She nodded, repeating his name in her mind. It suited him, strong yet gentle. For a moment, silence settled between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt natural, as if words were not always necessary. Then, Daniel spoke again. Do you come here often? Emily shook her head. Not really. I usually cannot afford it. But today I just needed a break. Daniel studied her for a moment, as if he could see past the words she had spoken, past the barriers she had built around herself. You are doing your best, he said softly. And that is enough. Emily felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. She was used to fighting, struggling, pushing forward without acknowledgement. But here was a stranger, recognizing her effort without knowing her story. She took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the warmth soothe her. Thank you, she said again, and this time it was not just for the coffee. Daniel nodded, his expression calm yet understanding. And for the first time in a long time, Emily did not feel alone. Emily stared at the rising steam from her coffee, watching it curl into the air before vanishing. The warmth of the cup in her hands grounded her, but the presence of Daniel across the table unsettled her in a way she did not expect. There was something different about him, something that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in years. Daniel took a slow sip of his his gaze resting on her, but not in an intrusive way. It was a quiet, patient kind of attention, as if he was waiting for her to speak when she was ready. Emily let out a small sigh. You said you understand what it is like to do everything on your own. What did you mean by that? Daniel set his cup down, his fingers idly tracing the rim. I lost my parents when I was young, he said, his voice even, though there was a weight behind his words. It was just my younger sister and me for a long time. I had to grow up quickly, take care of her, make sure she had what she needed. Emily's fingers tightened around her cup. She had not expected that answer. That must have been difficult, she said softly. Daniel nodded. It was, but you do what you have to do. You keep moving forward. He paused before adding, I imagine you understand that better than most. Emily let out a quiet breath, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest. Yes, she admitted. I do. She hesitated for a moment, debating whether or not to say more. But there was something about Daniel that made her want to open up, even just a little. I have a son, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's expression softened. How old is he? 6, Emily replied. A small smile tugged at her lips despite herself. His name is Oliver. Daniel nodded, as if committing the name to memory. That is a great age. He must keep you busy. Emily let out a quiet laugh. Busy is an understatement. He is full of energy, always asking questions, always wanting to learn more about the world. Her smile faltered slightly. I just wish I could give him more. Daniel tilted his head slightly. More? Emily exhaled, looking down at her coffee. More stability. More time. More everything. I work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads, and even then, it feels like it is never enough. I barely get to see him some days. And when I do, I am too exhausted to be present the way I want to be. Daniel was silent for a moment before he spoke. It sounds like you are already giving him everything that matters. Emily looked up, surprised. What do you mean? Daniel's voice was calm, steady. You are giving him love. You are showing him resilience. You are teaching him what it means to work hard, to push forward even when things are difficult. Those are the things he will remember. Emily swallowed hard, caught off guard by the sincerity in his words. No one had ever said that to her before. For so long, she had felt like she was failing, like she was barely keeping her head above water. But now, sitting across from a stranger who somehow understood, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. She let out a slow breath, her grip on her cup loosening. Thank you, she said again, and this time, she truly meant it. Daniel gave her a small nod, as if he understood everything she did not say. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like maybe, just maybe, she was not alone in this fight. The cafe's quiet hum faded into the background as Emily absorbed Daniel's words. Something about them lingered in her mind, settling into the cracks of her self-doubt. It was strange how a stranger, someone who knew nothing about her struggles, could say exactly what she needed to hear. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen. Daniel took another sip of his latte, his gaze steady but gentle. He did not press her to speak, did not demand more of her than she was willing to give. And perhaps that was what made Emily want to say more. She exhaled, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. Some days I feel like I am drowning. Daniel did not react with surprise. He simply nodded, as if he understood that feeling all too well. Emily hesitated before continuing. I never planned for this. I never thought I would be raising a child on my own. But life does not always give you choices. Daniel tilted his head slightly. His father? Emily's lips pressed together for a moment before she spoke. He left when Oliver was 3. Said he was not ready for the responsibility. I begged him to stay, to think about our son, but in the end he walked away without looking back. She let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. At first I thought he would come back. That maybe he just needed time. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. That must have been incredibly difficult. Emily nodded. It still is, she paused, staring down at her coffee. But I could not fall apart. I had to keep going. For Oliver. Daniel studied her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. You are stronger than you realize. Emily met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. She had spent so many years believing she had to carry everything alone. But here, in the quiet of a small cafe, a stranger had stepped into her world and acknowledged the weight she carried without her having to explain it. It was unsettling. And comforting. Emily looked away, trying to gather herself. Enough about me, she said, forcing a small smile. What about you? You said you took care of your sister. What happened after that? Daniel leaned back slightly, considering his words. I worked hard, made sure she had everything she needed. She is married now, living in another city with her husband and kids. She is happy. A small smile flickered across his lips. That is all I ever wanted for her. Emily nodded. And you? Are you happy? Daniel's smile faded just a little. He glanced down at his cup as if searching for an answer. I do not know, he admitted finally. Emily was surprised by his honesty. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck. I spent so much time making sure she was okay that I never really thought about what I wanted for myself. Now, I have a stable job, a decent life, but something is missing. Emily tilted her head. What do you think that is? Daniel hesitated, his hazel eyes meeting hers. I think I have been alone for too long. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. For the first time since they sat down, Emily truly looked at Daniel, not just as the kind stranger who had bought her coffee, but as someone who carried his own burdens, his own loneliness. And in that moment, she realized they were not so different after all. Emily let Daniel's words settle in the space between them. She had not expected him to say that, to admit, so openly, that he felt alone. Most people avoided such confessions, masking their loneliness behind forced smiles and empty conversations. But Daniel did not. She studied him for a moment. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes, one she recognized all too well. It was the kind of loneliness that did not come from simply being alone, but from carrying too much for too long. She took a slow sip of her coffee before speaking. I understand that feeling, she said softly. Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. Emily exhaled. When Oliver's father left, I told myself that I did not need anyone. That I could do it all on my own. And for the most part I have. But there are nights when the silence is too loud. When I sit at the kitchen table after Oliver has gone to bed, and I realize I have no one to talk to. No one to share the little moments with. She hesitated before adding, it is a different kind of loneliness. The kind that does not go away just because you are surrounded by people? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, he said. That is exactly what it is. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the cafe surrounded them, but it felt distant, as if they existed in a separate space, just the two of them, bound by an unspoken understanding. Emily glanced down at her coffee, tracing the rim of the cup with her finger. Do you ever wonder if it is too late to change things? She asked. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, as if the question had struck something deep within him. Yes, he admitted. All the time. He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling. I have spent so many years focusing on work, on responsibilities, that I never stopped to ask myself what I actually want. Now, I look around and realize I have built a life, but I have no one to share it with. Emily tilted her head. But it is not too late, she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Daniel raised an eyebrow. She continued, I used to think that once things fell apart, they could never be put back together. That once you lost something, whether it was a person, a dream, or just a part of yourself, it was gone forever. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. But maybe life is not about what you lose. Maybe it is about what you choose to rebuild. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. I think you might be right, he said. Emily let out a small breath she had not realized she was holding. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel like she was drowning. And as she sat there, across from a man she had met only an hour ago, she felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. Hope, a quiet, fragile kind of hope. But hope nonetheless. The cafe had begun to fill with the afternoon crowd, the quiet hum of conversation growing louder. Yet for Emily and Daniel, the world outside their small table felt distant. It was strange how a simple conversation with a stranger had opened a door she had kept shut for so long. Emily glanced at her phone, realizing that time had slipped away. She would have to pick up Oliver soon. But she did not want to leave, not yet. Daniel seemed to sense her hesitation. He rested his forearms on the table, his fingers loosely clasped together. Can I ask you something? Emily nodded. Of course. Daniel's gaze was steady. When was the last time you did something just for yourself? Emily blinked, caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth to respond but found herself hesitating. The answer was painfully clear. She could not remember. Her days were filled with responsibilities. Work, bills, making sure Oliver had everything he needed. There was no space for anything else. Daniel must have seen the answer in her silence. He gave a small nod as if he understood. I thought so. Emily let out a breath, a tired smile tugging at her lips. It is just, there is never enough time. Or money. Or energy. She shook her head. Being a single mother is not something you get to take a break from. Daniel tilted his head slightly. But do you not think you deserve one? Emily hesitated. I do not know. Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. You do. The certainty in his words made something tighten in her chest. She had spent so long pushing forward, convincing herself that she had no choice but to keep going, no matter how exhausted she felt. But hearing it from someone else, from someone who had no reason to say it except that he believed it, made her pause. Emily exhaled, shaking her head slightly. And what about you? She asked, turning the question back on him. When was the last time you did something just for yourself? Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, leaning back in his chair. Touché. She raised an eyebrow. So? Daniel exhaled. It has been a while for me too. He glanced at his hands before looking back up at her. Maybe that is why I stopped today. Why I paid for your coffee? Emily frowned slightly. What do you mean? Daniel smiled, but there was something wistful in it. I think I needed this conversation just as much as you did. Emily was not sure what to say to that. But she knew one thing, he was right. She had walked into this cafe feeling alone, weighed down by the endless struggles of her life. But now, sitting across from Daniel, she felt lighter. Not because her problems had disappeared. Not because anything had changed. But because, for the first time in a long time, someone understood. Emily glanced at the clock on the wall. Reality was pulling her back. She had to go. She met Daniel's eyes. I should get going. I have to pick up Oliver from school. Daniel nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, hesitation, maybe even reluctance. Can I ask you one more thing? He said. Emily tilted her head. What is it? Daniel hesitated, then said, Would you like to meet again? The question caught her off guard. She had not expected it. But as she sat there, looking at the man who had turned a simple coffee into something far more meaningful, she realized she wanted to say yes. She took a slow breath, considering. Then, softly she said, I think I would. Daniel smiled. And just like that, something shifted. Something new had begun. Emily walked out of the cafe feeling different. Lighter, somehow, the world outside was unchanged, cars rolled by on the street, people hurried past, the city continued its endless motion, but something inside her had shifted. As she made her way to Oliver's school, she replayed the conversation with Daniel in her mind. It had been so long since she had spoken to someone without guarding herself, without bracing for judgment or pity. He had not looked at her with sympathy or condescension. He had simply listened. And now, she had agreed to meet him again. The thought sent a ripple of uncertainty through her. She had been so careful for years, so focused on surviving, that she had forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. But Daniel did not feel like a risk. He felt like something else. A possibility. She pushed the thought aside as she reached the school gates. The moment she saw Oliver, all her worries melted away. His small face lit up as he ran toward her, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders. Mom, he shouted, barreling into her. Emily laughed, crouching down to hug him. Hey kiddo. How was school? Oliver pulled back, his eyes shining. We learned about space today. Did you know that Jupiter has 67 moons? Emily smiled. 67? That is a lot. Oliver nodded enthusiastically. And Saturn has rings made of ice and rock. Can we go to the library later? I want to read more about planets. Emily ruffled his hair. Of course, but first, let us go home and get you something to eat. As they walked hand in hand, Oliver chattered excitedly about everything he had learned. Emily listened, but part of her mind was elsewhere. She had spent so long making sure Oliver had everything he needed. But today, for the first time in a long time, she had done something for herself. And it felt good. Later that evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Daniel had given her his number before they parted ways. He had not pressured her to use it, had simply said, if you want to meet again, just let me know. She took a slow breath, then typed a message. I enjoyed our conversation today. Let me know when you would like to meet again. She hesitated for a moment before pressing send. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. A few moments later, her phone buzzed with a reply. I enjoyed it too. How about Saturday? Emily stared at the message, a small smile tugging at her lips. Maybe, just maybe, life was not just about surviving. Maybe it was about finding something more. And for the first time in a long time, she was willing to try. Saturday arrived faster than Emily expected. As she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing out the fabric of her simple blue blouse, a familiar nervousness settled in her stomach. It had been years since she had gone out for anything other than work, errands, or school events. She barely remembered what it felt like to do something just because she wanted to. She glanced at Oliver, who was sprawled on the couch, flipping through a book about planets. Are you sure you will be okay with Mrs. Peterson? She asked. Oliver did not even look up. Mom, I am fine. It is only for a couple of hours. Emily smiled at his confidence. Mrs. Peterson, their elderly neighbor, had always been kind to them. She had offered to watch Oliver when Emily mentioned she had plans. Okay, Emily said, grabbing her coat. I will not be long. Oliver finally looked up, grinning. Have fun, Mom. Emily hesitated. Fun. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to enjoy anything. But as she stepped outside and took a deep breath of crisp autumn air, she decided she would try. She met Daniel at a small park on the edge of town. It was quieter than the bustling cafe where they had first spoken, surrounded by trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. A narrow path wound around a pond, where ducks floated lazily on the water. Daniel was already there, sitting on a bench, waiting. He looked up when he saw her, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I was starting to think you would change your mind," he said playfully. Emily shook her head, sitting beside him. "I almost did," she admitted. "Not because I did not want to come, but because this is new for me." Daniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "No pressure," he said. "We are just two people talking." Emily let out a small breath. "That is what I like about you. You make things feel easy." Daniel chuckled. "That is a first. My sister used to say I overthink everything." Emily tilted her head. "Maybe you do. But with me, you have been nothing but straightforward." Daniel looked at her for a moment, as if considering her words. Then he said, "That is because I see something in you, Emily. Something strong, even if you do not see it in yourself." His words made her heart tighten. She had spent so long convincing herself that she was just surviving, just getting by. But Daniel saw something else. She looked away, watching the ripples on the pond. "I think I forgot who I used to be," she admitted. Before life became all about responsibility. Daniel was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Maybe it is time to remember." Emily turned to look at him. "How?" He smiled, his eyes warm and steady. "By letting yourself live again." She felt the weight of his words settle inside her. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time. Emily had never considered what it truly meant to live again. She had spent years in survival mode, moving from one responsibility to the next without pausing to ask herself what she wanted. Now, sitting beside Daniel on a quiet park bench, his words echoed in her mind. Maybe it is time to remember. Maybe it is time to live again. She exhaled slowly, watching the ducks drift lazily across the water. "I would not even know where to begin," she admitted. Daniel leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "Start small," he said. "Do something just because it makes you happy. Not because you have to. Not because it is practical. Just because it reminds you that you are more than a mother, more than your struggles." Emily hesitated. She had forgotten what that kind of freedom felt like. But Daniel's steady presence made her feel safe enough to consider it. She turned to him, studying the man who had unexpectedly entered her life. "And what about you?" she asked. "What reminds you that you are more than your work?" Daniel smiled, but there was something distant in his eyes. "I am still figuring that out," he admitted. "For years, my career was everything. It gave me purpose. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the things that truly matter." Emily nodded in understanding. "It is easy to lose yourself when you are always focused on what needs to be done." Daniel exhaled. "Exactly." They sat in silence for a moment, the crisp autumn breeze rustling the leaves around them. Then, Daniel glanced at her, a playful glint in his eyes. "What did you love to do before life got in the way?" Emily blinked, caught off guard by the question. She thought for a moment, searching her memories. Then, slowly she said, "I used to love painting." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Painting?" Emily nodded. "Before Oliver was born, before life became so overwhelming, I used to paint. Nothing extraordinary, just simple things, landscapes, flowers, little moments that made me feel something." She smiled wistfully. "I cannot even remember the last time I picked up a brush." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Then maybe that is where you should start." Emily let out a soft laugh. "It is not that simple. I do not even have the supplies anymore." Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notepad and a pen. He tore out a page and handed it to her. "Then start with this," he said. Emily frowned, taking the paper. "What do you mean?" "Sketch something," Daniel said. "Right now, it does not have to be perfect. It does not even have to be good. Just put something on paper." Emily hesitated, looking down at the blank sheet. It had been so long since she had created anything just for the sake of it. But then, slowly, she lifted the pen and began to draw. Her strokes were hesitant at first, uncertain. But as she let go of the pressure to be perfect, the lines started to flow more naturally. She drew the trees in front of her, their branches stretching toward the sky. She sketched the curve of the pond, the ripples on the water. It was simple, rough, but it was something. When she finished, she looked up at Daniel. He was watching her with a small, knowing smile. "There," he said, "you just took your first step." Emily stared at the sketch in her hands, a warmth spreading through her chest. It was not just about the drawing. It was about allowing herself to rediscover a part of who she used to be. She met Daniel's gaze, something new shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "Anytime," and in that moment, Emily realized something. For the first time in years, she was not just surviving. She was beginning to live again. Days passed, but something inside Emily had changed. The sketch she had drawn in the park remained tucked inside her journal, a quiet reminder of the moment she had allowed herself to create again. She found herself thinking about it often, about the way Daniel had encouraged her without pressure, without expectation. And for the first time in years, she wanted more. One evening, after putting Oliver to bed, Emily sat at the kitchen table with a deep breath. In front of her was a blank sheet of paper, a set of pencils she had picked up from a discount store earlier that day. She hesitated, fingers resting lightly on the page, doubt creeping in. But then she thought of Daniel's words. Start small. So she did. She began sketching, the curve of a flower petal, the way light touched the edge of a leaf. The lines were shaky at first, but as she continued, her hands steadied, her confidence growing with each stroke. It was not perfect, but it did not have to be. It was hers. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The next time she met Daniel, it was different. Not because the cafe was any less crowded or the autumn air any less crisp, but because something inside her had shifted. She saw it in the way she smiled more easily, in the way she met his gaze without hesitation. Daniel noticed it too. "You have been drawing," he said, nodding toward the notebook in her hands. Emily chuckled. "It is nothing great." Daniel shook his head. "That is not the point. The point is that you are doing it." Emily looked down at the sketch she had brought to show him. A simple drawing of Oliver laughing, his head thrown back in joy. It was rough, imperfect, but full of life. "Oliver loves it," she said softly. "He asked me to draw him more pictures." Daniel smiled. "Then I would call that a success." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Emily spoke again. "I was scared," she admitted. "For so long, I thought that if I stopped moving, stopped focusing only on survival, everything would fall apart. But it turns out, I can still be a mother, still be responsible, and still have a piece of myself, too." Daniel's eyes softened. "You deserve that piece of yourself, Emily. You always have." Her heart swelled at his words. For so long, she had convinced herself that life was only about making it through the next day. But now, she realized that it could be more than that. It could be about small joys, about moments of connection, about rediscovering who she was beyond her struggles. And maybe, just maybe, it could also be about the possibility of something new. As she and Daniel sat there, sipping their coffee, she felt something unfamiliar but welcome, a quiet sense of hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to survival, but the kind of hope that comes from believing that life can still hold beautiful surprises. That maybe, just maybe, she was not alone anymore. And that was the beginning of something new. Something she was finally ready for. If you enjoyed this heartfelt and inspiring story, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to Ever After Stories for more emotional and uplifting tales. Every story has the power to touch hearts and remind us of the beauty of resilience, hope, and unexpected connections. Stay tuned for more compelling narratives that will keep you engaged from beginning to end. Subscribe now to Ever After Stories and be part of a journey filled with emotion, love, and inspiration.